All right, so we're just collecting everyone here, and I'm gonna have to slowly but surely add people in as they show up here. But figured we'd start off this webinar this evening. Obviously, I'm in a hotel room because I'm in Miami because I can't be in Pensacola right now, and Austin, I think, is in Tampa, and so just trying to get together and kind of give a rundown on what we think about the boats, but also give our rundown on or what we think about the conditions for this weekend in Pensacola, but also give a rundown on what we've learned so far from sail testing in Newport with the CST masts, and with that post that we put in the Facebook group, which is about that development set of 3D ice sails that are out in the world right now, and that Doug, who is also joining us, happens to be using this weekend in Pensacola. So anything to add there, Austin?
No, I just wanted to say sorry we're not down there this weekend, and I look forward to seeing everyone in January and February for the next two. So hopefully you guys get some wind tomorrow, and it's a good event for everyone.
Yeah, so I think we dive right into it here, which is going to be what are the conditions that you guys are going to see down this weekend in Pensacola. And Austin and I talked about this earlier, and this is the forecast that I actually pulled down this morning. I didn't have a second here to get an updated one, but it doesn't look super windy for what we've seen. So Saturday looks like you're probably going to have a little bit better breeze in the morning, and then a potential for a late afternoon sort of sea breeze shift. But the likelihood is more than likely it's going to be, kind of northerly in the morning, then potentially moving to east, and then actually shifting all the way around to southeast throughout the day. And in Pensacola, southeast is a really good direction. West is a bad direction. Northeast is a good direction if the fronts pass through. But again, it looks like it's going to be good conditions for racing because it looks like that sort of light spot in the middle of the day isn't going to be super long. It's going to be pretty short lived. So you'll have that breeze in the morning and the breeze in the afternoon. And Austin, have you spent a lot of time sailing in Pensacola and things to add on that?
I actually have not spent that much time in Pensacola. I'm looking forward to getting some more reps down there this winter. So unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot to add in terms of the conditions that you'll see in Pensacola, other than kind of the settings that we sail in when we're sailing in under 7 to 8 knots, or maybe potentially in that under base setting kind of wind range. I think sailing in Annapolis, we get a fair bit of that light air sailing, and a little bit of small chop as well. So yeah, that's kind of all I have there.
So based on the forecast, how would you plan to set your boat up this weekend if you were actually down in Pensacola going sailing, where you have that sort of 7 to 8 knots, everyone's hiking on the rail, you're just powered up, but you're not depowering?
Yeah, I think the whole goal is when you're in that underpowered setting, you're trying to get hiking as quickly as you can, because that's when the boat really starts to squirt forward, when you get the people on the rail and you're trimmed in, and the boat is kind of full tails back moving. So I typically sail in a 3-up boat, so we're more on the upper edge of that wind range. So we're definitely probably going to be, if I were there, dropping the rig to that under base setting, which would be the -2, -1, -0.5. I think maybe the 2-up boats, if you're closer to 400 pounds, maybe you're going to stay at base because you're already going to be hiking in the 7 or 8 knot puffs. I think a common mistake I see in that under 8 knot setting is you sail a little bit more heeled because it feels really good for the driver. But then as soon as you get moving, the mistake I see is people still stay heeled, where this boat has a very short quarter length keel, and you got to get that boat pressed flat again to really get the push forward, instead of staying heeled up like you might say in another boat that has a longer cord length keel. So I think it's a big mistake I see. Is it feels really good for the driver, but it's not necessarily the fastest way to sail. And probably the other mistake I see a fair bit is it feels really good in that light air to do a lot of easing and trimming, but it might not necessarily be the quickest as well. Like it feels really good to do a big ease and pull back in because the boat feels like it powers up. but probably, unless it was a big condition change, leaving the main trim to where it had been the whole time might have actually been a quicker way to get through the breeze there.
Yeah, I think we're on the
What
same
about you, Mike?
page. Yeah, exactly. So I think we're on the same page. I think it really comes down to trying to get everyone hiking, and that really is going to be the key for the conditions that you're going to see this weekend. Sometimes that means that the telltales you might be dancing the outside telltales. Sometimes that might mean that you might be dancing the inside telltales. But in reality, it's just trying to get that power in the rail of the boat, and where that comes from is, having the jib car, the jib on the clew board up enough so that you're actually getting enough depth in the foot of the jib, and then having, the out haul eased enough, and having the main sheet in tight enough. And really, when you're trying to get people on the rail, it's exactly as you said, Austin. It's not easy in the main sheet. It's just trimming it really hard, even harder than you'd think, and trying to actually stall that upper telltale to stop it, but then keeping the bow down while you're doing it, resisting the urge to let the bow drive up while you're doing that, which is just scrubbing power out of the rail. And if you can keep people on the rail and keep pushing the boat into the water, you're going to be getting that righting moment that you're looking for from the crew, which is just sort of increasing your leeway across the keel, which is actually increasing the flow, and therefore you're going to end up being higher than the person next to you for the same or a fast speed forward. And I think all those things, when you put them into the equation, you end up being able to actually accelerate forward off the line, and the first person off the line that's able to get into that mode is going to be able to escape the group. And so you're going to have with the 3 or 4 boats that can escape the group, who are able to get into that mode first. And your next group, if you're not in that first batch, is going to be try and attack, or tack and tack back to get a clear lane to be able to get the bow down and get the boat accelerated and get away clean like that.
Yeah, I think not having a thin lane off the line will be key tomorrow to get into that setting. Like if you set up in a thin lane, it's going to be very difficult to probably get there without clearing yourself first.
Right.
Mike, what do you do with your jib in these settings? I know you mentioned moving up on the clew board, but are you still on that kind of sweet spot track setting? Are you maybe a little further out, or are you're in the same spot and then eased a little bit on your sheet? Kind of how do you set your jib up in that under 8 knot setting?
That's an interesting one. I think actually we've been experimenting with this a lot, and it is basically that sweet spot track setting, if not maybe a half a car width inside of that. So instead of that red line being in the middle of the car, you're kind of the outside of the car is on that red line. Is that kind of what you guys use?
Yeah, we're that, and then we're probably eased more than we normally would be. So getting that depth in the bottom of the jib, but probably keeping the overall leach somewhat back in the same spot of where it was when you're in that fully powered mode.
And that ends up being about 1 inch to 2 inches between the blocks on the sail. And then and then you end up being probably on the 4th hole down from the top is, in that condition where you're really powered up on the bottom. Maybe if you start trimming it hard, you might end up, 1 car further down, but you kind of need the grunt sometimes in the bottom part of the sail.
Yeah, and I think if you're in the position where you can be easing the jibs out of the tack as well, that's a big gain too. Like having just another inch of ease to get the boat moving out of the tack. I think some people get stuck into the self-tacking jib, and they don't necessarily play the jib as much as they can, especially in the lighter air. So making sure that the crew does do a bit of an ease out of the tack is good to get the boat moving quickly again.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's a huge one. I think the easing out of the tack in this condition, easing the main and the jib, coming out a little bit low and being able to steer the boat up as you come out of the tack, I think are all, going to be huge parts. It's something that we talk about more than we probably should between Hayden and I when we're sailing together. We talk about, cracking the jib, and there is too much. Of course, it's a high aspect jib. The leach opens really quickly. Easing 4 inches, 5 inches is too much. Easing, half an inch isn't necessarily wrong. It's probably not quite enough, but maybe even easing 3/4 of an inch to an inch is probably about the right. We're talking about, instead of a half an inch, we're talking about, a full inch of ease in this condition, and then powering the boat up. If you ease too much, you just end up having the top of the sail luffing.
Yeah, and then you're losing power.
Exactly. Anything else to add in that condition? I mean, I know that there's
No,
a
I
lot
think,
going on.
all the normal stuff that you would do, easing your jib halyard a bit, especially if you get a big lull, putting some more power on the front of the jib, but then also not being afraid to, when you do get that 8 or even 9 knot puff, taking the slack back out of the jib halyard as well. I think it's easy to ease it in light air, but it's also easy to forget to bring it back in when you do finally hit that power setting where you're using all the power you can take, and then start bringing that halyard back on and taking some depth back out of the jib to get some height.
Exactly.
All the normal stuff you do in any other boat, but just on this boat are more easily forgotten just because of, and over 10 knots, we're kind of overpowered already and playing, dumping the main and doing all that sort of stuff. So in the light air, remember, it's still a sailboat. We got to change all the controls on.
It was interesting. One of the things that you said, which was about, sort of this condition and the rig tune, which we haven't really touched on, and what you'd be doing, which is 1 step or 2 steps up. And on the call, we have our special guest today, who's Doug Clark, who we did stuff we're going to talk about later on the call, which is the CST mast and the 3DI sails. Did a lot of testing with Doug, but he was actually in Pensacola going sailing today. And, one of the things that can happen in this condition, when you're actually out there, on the water, is that you either end up too tight or too loose on the rig. And we all know that too loose on the rig means you see your overbend wrinkles going more than 50% of the way back. But too tight is that feeling where the boat never gets freed up, and you end up with a really knuckle forward main, and you end up feeling like you have to use the jib, and the boat's stuck in the water. And I know that today's condition was probably a little bit windier than what you're going to see tomorrow, based on the forecast that what I've looked at. But Doug, if you just give us your 2 cents on what you saw on the water today from sailing in Pensacola, what you guys were doing on the rig.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. I'm psyched to be here. I've actually been here all week. Today's the first day going out sailing. And the one thing that I have seen is that the forecasts have not necessarily been thus far very accurate. Let's hope the one that you have tomorrow is good there. It kind of started off kind of light in the morning, and I guess we all kind of left the dock around 1:30, or boat started to leave the dock around 1:30, and it got up to, I think we were at due south or so, and it got up to like 8 or 12. I think the water depth in the racing area there is about 25 feet or so, and it does have a long fetch. But the Pensacola Beach Peninsula is kind of due south of us, so it was relatively flat water with a little, maybe just a little tiny chop when the breeze got up, up to 12 knots or so, and it was pretty steady. It was definitely fairly steady. It's a nice sailing area, that's for sure. And it looks like the southerly direction, anywhere out of that south is a really good direction for this venue too. And we weren't that far out past the channel, because like the leeward side of the course, right outside of the channel there. So it wasn't that far of a sail out to the course. And mind you, today, we're doing practice starts and short races. It was only like probably a half-mile beat or so. We're just kind of doing one lap. We did 3 of them. No, potential. It looks like a great sailing venue for sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the heads up on that. When I was there a couple of weeks ago, I found that the last one in this list of models, the HRR, the 8 a.m. forecast was pretty accurate to what the day was going to be. They were quite close at times. If there was something that was going to overtake it, it was going to be a sea breeze that it wasn't expecting. But they were pretty accurate. But just in terms of rig stuff that you guys were looking at today, it sounds like you were somewhat in that range that we're talking about, which is powered up versus just slightly overpowered. And what were you guys finding just in terms of, just course rig tune? Of course, we'll go into the CSC stuff later, but just in terms of course rig tune, what were you guys finding on the water today?
Yeah. I think we left the dock at, or, kind of our base setting, there. And when we first went out, we went one step up, which is kind of T1.5. And, Jeff and I are probably around 300 or just shy, or 400, just shy of 400 or so. But that notwithstanding, we ended up going, when the max velocity of the day, we ended up going 2 steps up. And when it's a flat water venue, and I learned some of this from you, Mike, fairly flat water venue, I personally like my head stay to be pretty firm there and not bounce around, particularly if I have to ease the main out at all there. And so, so that kind of worked for us today. We had other things going on to, with the boat and say, just to getting up to speed again myself, being back in a VX1. But, in general, maybe a little tiny tight, but I didn't mind being those 2 steps up, at least on the caps.
Right. So, and that's exactly kind of what we were discussing, a little bit earlier, and what Austin and I have been talking about, which is that being slightly tighter on the rig, being able to keep the main sheet in, keep the power in the boat, and isn't the worst thing when you're in flat water. And then, the only thing to watch out for is that you don't get too deep in the bottom of the front where you feel like you're going to have to ease the jib. Is that also sort of what you found as well, Austin, in these kind of conditions, based on what Doug's describing from, actually being in the venue and going sailing?
Yeah, I think anytime you're getting a puff and you do have to ease the main. And so you're then working into that, maybe instead of fighting for power, you're into that powered or overpowered setting. The firmer head stays, you're seeing the flat water is nice because, as we know, we have no backstay in this boat. So all of the head stay tension is really controlled by the caps. So I think everything Doug's saying makes a lot of sense there if you're in the flat water venue. I guess in Sarasota, it's, where we have been in the past when we get that, it's the direction, I guess it's the southerly where it's pretty flat, I think. And it's kind of the same sort of deal where you can kind of be maybe a step up higher than you normally would be, and you can take the height a little more. And then if it's choppy, you got to go back to that more powered up setting, because these are pretty flat boats, so they don't go to the chop nearly as well.
Exactly. And so, one of the questions that we've actually just had come in has to do with, what actual numbers are these? And this kind of leads into our discussion that we've talked about, between the Southern and what is, for the people who have new boats and have the CST mast, what are the differences and what are the actual tuning numbers? And so I just figured I'd pull up the little image of, sort of how I've been over the last couple of years, sort of how I've been tuning the boat and what we've had in our tuning guide for a while. And it's, really these base numbers that we've been talking about are 28 on the caps and 18 on the, on the intermediates, and then 11 on the check stays. And so we're, it's kind of it seems to be that allows you to keep the mast at the spreaders and at the check stays kind of in column as you pull the main sheet on, as you pull the vang on, and not get the overbend wrinkles too far back. With that said, depending upon the boat, I've sometimes ended up somewhere in the range of, 20, 23 on the intermediates and 11 on the check stays. And so somehow that intermediate shroud is it seems to be quite boat dependent, based on the mast, based on the spreaders. And I'm sure Austin and Doug, I know Doug and I have talked about a million times, but I'm sure Austin, you found a similar thing in your travels between the boats.
Yeah, I think it's always good to follow the guide, but you also got to use your eyes when it comes to these. They're definitely a guide. So I know every time we move the rig in the boat, we always go upwind and check the side to side bend. So I think, when you're reading these really low numbers in the loose gauge in general, like down at 11 or 18 is a higher number. When you're setting these boats up from scratch and you're reading these low numbers, it's good to go out on the water. And if you do need to take a half turn off here or put a turn on there because the rig's not setting up straight tack to tack, it's gonna happen to you. And it's good to get caliper numbers as well so that you can get back to it on the water if you ever lose where you are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, essentially what I do is I just sight the rig, and then see if we got a straight rig or a little bit of leeward sag or, even a little bit of windward poke sometimes.
So exactly, I think that's exactly on it. And then the outcome of that is the overbend wrinkles through the main, and you're trying to get those to be 50% of the way back through the sail as you know, all the way from the spreaders down to the foot is where you're looking for them to be. You know, the spreaders are going to be much further forward, but then the max they come back just above the windows ends up being about 50% of the way. And you know, and in reality, it's exactly as you said, is that you always find something, you know, all the boats are slightly different, all the masts are slightly different. And so you end up, you know, being ever so slightly different between the two of them. So the guide is a great guide, but it doesn't give you, you know, all the information for your boat. And then, you know, again, I'm not sure this is the guide that I use in terms of steps between them. But again, it's that same thing that I've said before. It's 2 1.5. So that means 2 turns on the caps for every 1 turn on the intermediates for every half turn on the check stays. And that's something we've been using for quite some time. And that's kind of this updated guide. And I don't know, again, if that's what you guys have been using, Austin. And I know that Doug and I have been talking about this a lot, but it's, you know, I'm not sure if there's something different that you guys are doing there, Austin.
No, I think, I don't know if we've quite ever gotten to like the 2.5 to 3.5 on the checks. We were kind of a little late to the party on doing the, you know, we were always stepping up a little bit on the checks, but never going maybe that far. We were always more of an emphasis on just the side to side bend and obviously not over bending the main as well. So like, I guess we would look for in light air, you know, just maybe 1/4 inch of sag, and then maybe 10 to 16 trying to keep the rig straight, and then over that maybe even just a touch, like a 1/4 inch of windward poke was kind of the focus when we were setting the rig.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because, you know, based on what we found, if you go into the you know, the boat park, and you say, okay, well, let me go through the tuning range, and you don't actually do any turns on the checks actually get looser compared to the rest of the rig, which when you're putting a lot of bang on, they're the only thing keeping the middle of the mast going forward when you put a ton of bang on. So they're, you know, sort of stopping it from happening. And so at that point, it's kind of saying, okay, well, at least that half a turn seems to match the checks with the rest of the rig and kind of keeping them at 11 as you go up through the rest of the rig. So, so go ahead.
I was to say, yeah, we found that, like I said, we've never gotten to 3.5, but we were probably doing like 1 pretty quickly, 2 pretty quickly, and then maybe that last half to a last turn as we're getting way up the range is kind of how we've always gone.
Right. So, and I think that's really interesting because in reality, as you go through the range, when you do the tuning this way in the boat park, the pre-bend in the mast that you see just when it's sitting there on land is very similar all the way through the range, and the shrouds just get tighter. It's not like you're increasing the pre-bend. And that seems to be because in the light side of the range, you're trimming the main really hard, and that's putting a lot of force into the mast. And then as you get breezier and breezier, you're using the vang to transfer that exact same load into the mast, just more point loaded. And so, you know, that's why keeping the pre-bend the same, but the whole rig gets tighter seems to be working for the boats.
I agree. Yeah, because if you get too full, go ahead.
No, go.
Yeah, I was gonna say just keeping the front of the main not too full seems to be fast in the boat because of how tight the sheeting angle is. You can start running the main, I think, pretty quickly with the jib if you don't keep the pre-bend the same in the front of the main with relatively the same entry, and then obviously getting a little bit flatter as it gets windier. But you know, keeping that entry of the main never too full, I think is quick in this boat.
Right. I agree with that entirely. And so we actually did some in Newport, Streamline, Ian, Hayden, Doug, myself, and Jeff did some testing with that new CST mast for those of us that actually have them to see, you know, kind of where they ended up. What are the differences? And in reality, on shore, what we found, and Doug can, you know, fill us in a little bit on this more, but on shore, what we found is we got on land, we said, okay, well, the pre-bend's a little bit less for the CST mast, so let's go ahead and put the caps on more and ease the lowers and try to get the pre-bend on shore to be the same between the two sections. And then we went out on the water and we ended up actually undoing everything that we did on shore, just systematically undoing everything we did on shore. And we ended up, for all intents and purposes, essentially in the same space. And, and the only change is the note that I've said at the bottom of this, which is that the CST mass, you probably should have 30 instead of 28 on the caps, which is essentially another 2 turns for the rest of the turns in the rig. And what that is that it seems that the increased, the spreaders in the CST mast are slightly more swept back, and the mast section itself seems to be slightly stiffer. So what we were doing on land was we were trying to make the pre-bend the same, which is very much related to the mast tube itself. And when we actually went on the water with the spreaders being slightly further back, we ended up with a very similar bend that we were seeing from the previous mast, which actually makes sense. And it's all in keeping from what we've seen. So we actually ended up back in the same place. And that extra, 2, whatever the number 2 is on the, whatever that amount of 2 numbers on the PT1 tension gauge are, is really what we ended up changing, just to induce a tiny little bit more bend into the section. But in reality, that's right in keeping with some of the medium to stiffer southern masts that we've seen. And feel free to have Doug jump in here to give his take on it. But from what I was looking at, it was very in keeping with the medium to the stiffer side of the CST masts, and with this tuning.
Yeah, I would add on that, and it goes back to a comment that both you guys made a little bit before, that whether it's a CST mast or a southern mast. Okay, well, one preliminary indications are, from the 2 times we've sailed the boat, what we've done so far is that the mast is not like radically different than any other mast. Okay, it's a VX1 mast. Okay, I can tell you that. But the second is that, I had 241, and it took me several regattas to kind of find the sweet spots on 241. Going from the guide, and was it a turn here, half turn there on lowers or uppers or whatever, and Mike, you alluded to before, that ended up in 241. My lowers needed to be a little bit tighter on that boat, because it seemed like the mast was bending a little bit more. So we were more like 21 or 22 on the lowers for a base instead of 18. On this boat, I think that will be, in this mast, we'll be going through that same learning process, but from a base setting, of having just inducing a little bit more pre-bend by the caps tight, seems it's been a great starting point thus far. And we'll keep sailing, and whether it's the mast itself or the sails we're using, and go from there, and keep figuring stuff out and kind of fine tune this boat.
Perfect. Sounds like it's as we've said, a million times, it's all within keeping of what we're expecting, and
Yep.
a couple turns here, a couple turns there, it just seems very very close. So there doesn't seem to be much to be. It's a bright future for the class, I think, with a new mast builder. And in the Southern Spar, big compared to the Southern Spars rig, I think it's a bright future for what we're looking for. Anything to add in there, Austin?
No, I'm excited to get my hands on the CST mast. I think it's just to reiterate the point of every mast is a little bit different, and taking detailed notes when you get in is very important. I don't see a lot of people using calipers in the VX1, so hopefully we can get that to be more of a trend, so that if you ever do lose yourself on the water, obviously you can't pull a loose gauge out when you're out sailing, but having a good way to get back to base on the water is very important. And I think try and get everyone in this class, kind of, once they find their numbers, having them written down on the boat, ready to find base at any point, is going to be important going forward.
Sounds like you and Michelle need a new boat. If you want to get one of those CST masts.
Yeah, I have to get one of the new masts.
Well, the big one being the last thing we want to cover here, and we wanted to keep this short because we know it's late for everyone here, and kind of keep this together. But this is really the main, between the CST masts and the stuff that we were talking about with the sails that Doug is using this weekend. It's the main goal for the webinar that we have here tonight. And the big one that I have to cover here is obviously, with myself and Austin and Doug, we said we wanted to try to do something different in Newport, and so we wanted to try to test these. We wanted to test and answer the questions about the CST masts, and then, for my side of it, I wanted to test and I wanted to see if I could, for the class, make a sail that lasted longer than Mylar sails would, and it would go through a bigger range. And so, in my head, I'm thinking about it and I'm trying to figure out how I can do that. And so the thought there was trying to make something out of what we use, which is North, which is 3DI. And the whole concept behind 3DI is that there's no more Mylar in it. But the set of sails that you see with Doug this weekend are entirely within the class rules. They only use polyester. They make the minimum weights of the sails within the class, and but they are just that. They are just a prototype set of sails. So I wanted to kind of take some time to dive into those a little bit, and our thoughts that we're trying to move forward with those sails, and just kind of get Doug's thoughts on what he's seen on them so far. But the main points that we're trying to get to, and I'm sure Austin can reiterate some of the things that we're talking about, is that really the goal is to make a set of sails that last longer, that is very similar in price point. I don't know what prices are going to be. They're very, but the goal is to make them similar in price point, and to make a set of sails that goes through a wider range, and frankly, to make a set of sails that isn't going to get ruined when you have a bad furl on the furler. And all those things came together to make this sort of test set of 3DI sails, which is the post in the Facebook group, and and kind of what we're seeing down in Pensacola. So Austin, your thoughts, before we dive into Doug, who's actually looked at them, anything to add there on that?
Yeah, well, personally, I'm really excited to give them a try. I do, obviously I sail in other classes other than the VX where we use 3DI, and then also in the big boat world, there's a lot of cool stuff going on with the 3DI molded technology, where we've gotten rid of the Mylar. I think the spread filament aspect of the sails is the coolest part for me, how we're taking a fiber and breaking it kind of back down into its filaments, and using it in an even better way than how we purchased the raw material to begin with. I think the sails will be a little bit, hopefully perform the same, but definitely be more durable. I've seen them used and abused offshore and treated very poorly by bowmen all over the country. And no matter how they throw them down the hatch, wrinkled in a ball, they seem to come back out looking almost the same as how they did when they went down as soon as they get inflated with air. So I think the big one is going to be, like Mike said, if you have a bad furl, you unfurl it again, it hits the wind, it inflates again, it looks back the way it should, as opposed to having maybe a nasty wrinkle that the Mylar sails might have had memory from before, from a bad furl.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really the key. I think the other couple of things before we hear from Doug, who's actually gone and used them. Timeline, as I said, they're entirely a set of prototype sails. With any sail development, these just happen to look very different, which is why we sort of have to talk about them. With any kind of sail development, it's the first set is a prototype set. You are always moving forward and trying to innovate and trying to do different things, and for sure there needs to be another set. And after you get to the testing of the first set, the building of the next set, sooner, without fail, you are always a year away from whenever your first set came out. And I think that's a thing to remember with this stuff, is that it's not that they're there making everything else obsolete. It's not that they're available right now. They're just there to test and understand. And, at some point they will be. So Doug, what have you seen based on your time with them? Of course, new boat, new time in Pensacola, just getting out on the water. And so far you've seen them for probably roughly, maybe 2 hours total, because you had roughly the 45 minutes, and Hayden and I had about, an hour with them. You probably even had less in Newport. So, give us your thoughts on what you've been seeing with them.
Yeah. Well, it's cool I want to thank you, Mike, for, allowing me to be involved in the process. It's really cool to be, involved in not just sail development, but development of a special class that we're all involved in here. So, I love the fact that we're trying to take things, forward and make stuff that is, whether it's the boat, the masts, the CST or sails like 3DI, that, we're trying to make it better, more user friendly and with a wider range and keep costs, try to contain costs. So, well done and all that stuff. The first thing I would say is that, the first thing I'll say is that, for a performance standpoint, I think it would be like foolish to say, oh man, they're really fast or they're really slow or anything like that, but they, right out of the box, you put the sail up, they're very fair, and they're very smooth. They look good, they look good. And you can't always say that. There you go. You got a couple of pictures there. I mean, the mainsail, it looks good, there. But that said, it also looks different. Okay. So not only does it look different, like off the boat when you're like, oh man, that's a black sail compared to the other, the other colored sails. But looking at it, I think the first thing in the mainsail anyway, is I'm going to have to get used to looking at a different sail. And then when you're like, where the bend is and putting bang on and that kind of stuff like that. And that could be just the fact that it's a different color. Okay. Just the fact that it's a different color, making sure, and then the sunlight on it, the sun on one tack versus another tack, and the GNAV and all that kind of stuff, all that kind of stuff. So, and on the jib, so I don't have much intelligent things or quantifying to say, but the jib, I think the one thing that I could say from the time that we sailed in Newport and then today and talking to you, kind of the range on maybe the jib cloth. I call it jib cloth, not jib halyard, because it's a fixed forestay. Range is probably a little bit higher in terms of, loose to tight on the jib Cunningham, and might be using the clue board a little bit more. We've got all those holes on that clue board, and in previous sails we're using maybe 2, maybe 3. There's a potential maybe to use a couple more in these sails. So those are the preliminary things. But looking forward to sailing this weekend. I think the only way that we're really going to be, to figure things out is to use them and go sailing and go racing. So psyched on that.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for the feedback on them. And again, super appreciate the time out on the water. And the thing with this webinar is I wanted to open it up as an open forum to anyone who had any questions on any of this stuff, the CST masts or the sails, to be able to say, or even the tuning or anything like that, to be able to ask questions. So feel free to use the chat box to do that. But again, it's just, as Doug said, I think the key with the sails is, as we know, the boats go from trying to be as deep as you can make the sails with the leeches trimmed as hard as you can possibly go, to making the sails as flat as you can make them with the leeches as open as they can be. And anything you can do to make the sail go completely through that range is going to be really critical. And, and then if you can double that down with something that actually lasts a long time and, lasts better than Mylar sails, then I think that's a win-win. Well, as long as you can, that's a win-win as long as you can keep costs in check. Because for me, one of the coolest things about the VX is that, the sails are not that expensive. They obviously do have a significant cost to them, but compared to a lot of other classes, the sail costs are kept quite low. And one of the things that I want to do is I want to continue to keep them that low, because I'm really trying to push that forward, trying to make sure that we're not just out here, making an arms race, making a problem for everyone in the class, because, sailing is an expensive sport, and we'd rather spend the money on getting to these cool venues, getting to go to Pensacola, and in past years, getting to go to Sarasota. And we'd rather spend money on the boats and actually having a good place to stay, rather than just completely blowing the budget on sails and that kind of stuff. So I think the thing moving forward is, I think at least the place where I've gone with them and where I've talked about going with Doug with them, is that keeping an open mind with them and saying that maybe there is something to be had here. And I think there are some benefits, and we've seen it in a ton of other classes. We've seen it in almost every, so it was only time before, before this happened. Like these sails use a very similar layout to what we used in the 49er. And, the class has moved in this direction as well. So, really trying to, keep pushing this forward and keep the boat going well and keep trying to learn more.
I think we had a question, Mike, from Brian Shores, and he was wondering, can you speak to the different window shape on the 3DI main? Is it easier or more difficult to see the overbend wrinkles?
Now that I've put that photo up
I
there,
think that's two questions. I think that might be two questions. Yeah.
yeah, now that I've put that photo up there, it's pretty obvious. Yeah. Huh? The jib window is not too far off, but the main one is quite different. And I think I'd actually have to go to say that, at least when I put them up, it was for a limited time in Newport. It was pretty cold. And for those of you everyone that knows me well, I really hate being cold. So it was pretty cold at Newport on that day. So I was trying to make sure that I learned what we needed to learn and couldn't wait to get down to the warm. But from what I've seen, yes, it is a little bit different, but again, it's as Doug said, and Doug can allude to it more, but it's as Doug said, it's a learning, it's just a little learning curve. And just with anything else, you learn where the overbend wrinkles are, you learn what they look like, and you learn them quickly. And and you say, okay, well, that's what an overbend wrinkle looks like on an opaque sail, and that's what it looks like on a clear sail. And and so it's they do show up. The window itself doesn't change where they show up. It's just that they might look a little bit different depending upon the color of the sail. And Doug, is that what you found as well?
Yeah, what I was going to say is that I wasn't sure which window you were talking about there for a second, because the top window on the main is in a perfect spot. I can actually see the leech tail on the jib. So it's actually in a perfect spot. Whatever you did with it, it's great.
A little different. That's been something that's been bothering me for years, that it was in the wrong spot. You ended up on mute there, Doug. But if there was any insights into the main window and how the overbend wrinkles look different?
Yeah, I didn't see, like, looking at the photo right now, I didn't really see any of that today. I'm looking at Jeff here too. I don't think we really saw anything, and I didn't really have to play around with like the the tack straps around the main too there. So I don't have anything to add on there. We didn't have that. When I'm looking at that picture right now, we didn't see that today.
Okay, no problem. Well, so that's kind of what we wanted to get through this evening, and Austin and I are around, and if anyone who's on here who happens to be in Pensacola has any specific questions that they want to fire across, they can feel free to reach out to either of us, and big thanks to Doug for being able to join us tonight. I know it might be past your bedtime. What is it, 8:45 there? Is that past your bedtime there in Pensacola?
Well, I'm still on East Coast time, so it is past my bedtime.
It's long past
Yeah.
your bedtime. Well, we don't want to keep him up too late. So, but I want to thank everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining here. And and as I said, any questions, just send them along to Austin and myself, and we'll keep everyone updated as we learn more about the 3DI and understand more. And thanks everyone for the time, for being out here this evening and joining us.
Yeah, and happy to chat with anyone in Pensacola.
Thanks, guys.
Come on over and check stuff out.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing everyone at the next one in January.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone.